photo of a dying Marine, of a battle that was happening. And the AP's managing editor, John Danishewski, I believe is how it's pronounced, talked about this. The CEO, actually, of the Associated Press, Thomas Curley, ultimately made the decision to publish this photo. Here's what was happening. The Associated Press had a reporter embedded with a Marine group in Afghanistan, and the Marines were ambushed, where there was a firefight that went on, and a Marine was killed. And the AP photographer shot a picture, and it's from a fair distance away. And what's startling about the picture, mostly, at least for me, is that you see all this kind of gray. You see the gray of the landscape and the rocky landscape, and the trees are kind of dying and dead, and it's all gray, and the gray of the camouflage of the uniforms, and then there's this kind of burst of red, which is the Marine's blood, where it's soaked his clothes. It's not grotesque or graphic. It's not the kind of picture that you would turn away from. In fact, I found myself finding it very hard to turn away from it. Morbid fascination? No, I don't think so. I think it's more like, okay, so that's what war looks like. And the head of our Pentagon, our Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, has specifically asked the AP not to publish the photo. Now, to the best of my knowledge, prior to this, there have been no widely publicized photos of our soldiers dying in these wars. I don't know, maybe I've missed some. Have you seen any? I have not seen any. Now, if you look at the press of much of the rest of the world, the British press will occasionally show photos, although they're very wary of showing photos of British soldiers dead and dying. We routinely show photos of Afghans dead and dying. In fact, I watched 60 Minutes over the weekend, and there were a number of close-ups of dead Afghanis. Now, had those been dead U.S. soldiers, there wouldn't have been a single one, I guarantee you. And in fact, there were dead U.S. soldiers, and there were no pictures of them. What's going on is that we have, and by the way, this is nothing new. I mean, the enforcement of it with the Bush administration's saying that photos of the caskets coming home can't be taken is the most modern, obvious incarnation of it. But, going all the way back to World War II, or to World War I for that matter, by and large, we tried not to show pictures ever since photography came along. I don't know to what extent we had photography during the Spanish-American War, but in Teddy Roosevelt's day. But we've tried not to show pictures of the cost of war to us. And what this does, in my opinion, is it makes it a lot easier for Americans, particularly those Americans whose families never served, like the Bush family, in war, or at least in contemporary wars. The families of most of the 750,000 families in America who represent the top 1/2 of 1% of Americans, who own almost a third of everything in America, whose families are not going off to war. It allows us all to just kind of say, well, we admire their service, but we really don't know what's going on with war. So the AP decided they were going to show this one picture, and it wasn't a particularly gory picture. You didn't see the guy's face. You didn't see the agony on his face. You didn't see his wound. All you saw was, the fact that here's this guy, here's a dead guy with some blood on his uniform from a distance. I'd guess about a 40 or 50-foot distance. And this has got Sarah Palin calling it evil on her Facebook page, which is apparently how she has now chosen to communicate with the world. You don't have nasty reporters asking follow-up questions when you're posting to Facebook. And I'm just wondering, the Vietnam War, I think that we really started to lose the Vietnam War when the draft really started to, by lose the Vietnam War, I mean the American people, the Democratic Lyndon Johnson administration lost the support of the American people. When we had to draft young men to go over there, and women went over as well, the draft was limited to men, but when we were drafting young men to go over to Vietnam, and our news media was, they didn't, again, they weren't going for the gory shots, but they were at least showing combat, and they were occasionally showing dead people. And Americans got it, that this was a real war and people were dying, and we're asking the question, what the hell are we dying for over there? And there never was a satisfactory answer. I mean, the answer was, because if Vietnam goes communist, then so will Laos and so will Cambodia and so will Burma. Well, they still are. China was already communist. The Soviet Union. I mean, isn't it up to the people themselves? Well, that's getting into a whole other larger context, and I'm certainly not going to relitigate the Vietnam War right now. But my point is that one of the great lessons of Vietnam for the U.S. military was to only embed friendly media, to take control of that process, to basically control the media, to control the images that we're seeing. And here you have Robert Gates, appointed by George W. Bush and then reappointed by President Barack Obama, saying, no, this is wrong. We don't want this picture shown. Now, also the family didn't want the picture shown. That's the one area where I would be a lot more deferential were I the Associated Press, except for the fact that it wasn't a close-up shot of this soldier. You couldn't identify him. Nobody could look at that picture and say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. And so, were I the Associated Press, I would have made the same decision. And in fact, I hope they make it more often. I hope that Americans start seeing the consequences of war, because the consequences of war are real. The consequences of war are terrible. We have, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, we saw video games. You recall under the first George Bush, we were seeing, and you had all these generals on TV, moderating the video game. Well, here we see this thing going down through this chimney, and then the building goes poof. And isn't that like magic? It took out the enemy. Well, who was in that building? It turns out that there were enormous numbers of children and non-combatants, men and women who had nothing to do with the combat. That we were taking out critical infrastructure like electric and telephone and water treatment plants and sewage treatment plants, so that now major cities in Iraq have no access to these things, or very limited access to these things. Life has turned into absolute hell in Iraq. We've got somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million dead there. You've got 2 million internal refugees, people who have had to flee their own homes. You've got 3 million external refugees, people who had to flee the entire country. Ongoing violence, death squads. You've got an absolute total mess that, the gates of hell were opened by George W. Bush. And we're not supposed to see what that looks like? We're not supposed to know what we did, particularly to our own soldiers? We're not supposed to show the going on 5,000 now. I think when you combine both wars over all this time, it's probably over 5,000. And we never show the contractors, the mercenaries. We have no idea how many mercenaries we've lost there. But I would guess it's at least hundreds and at least 1,000, probably many thousand. The cost of war is not acknowledged by Americans, and it should be. In much of the European press, you see the pictures of the cost of war, and guess what? They don't want to go to war. It's time for us to show our people. It's time for our media to show Americans what actually happens, to point out that war is legalized mass murder. Pure and simple. It's legalized psychosis. It leads to the death of the combatants, and it leads to the death of the non-combatants. It destroys the lives of all the people it touches. And while it's arguably the most profitable industry in the United States, and the golden calf of capitalism in this country, it should not be glorified, and it should not be sanitized.